So I'm delighted to have with me Professor John Curtice, who is the President of the British Polling Council. John, thank you for joining us to share your thoughts on this new guide for journalists and opinion polls.
Not at all, Simon. Nice to talk to you.
Thank you. So just to kick off, can you remind me a little bit about what the British Polling Council is seeking to do and how it fits into the bigger picture of the media and polling today?
Well, one of the things the British Polling Council has tried to do in order to promote its remit of improving the transparency of polling and widening understanding as much as possible has indeed in a variety of ways to particularly to interact with journalists, telling them what we're doing, make sure that they can have access to how polls are being done at the moment and some of the issues, but also just simply trying to ensure that journalists, as far as they are able, do their best with the reporting of polls. And we've long since had a journalist guide to reporting opinion polls, but it's been a fair while since it was done, and shall we say it was done in the age when worrying about design, etc., wasn't with us. And in the meantime, the House of Lords have had a select committee on opinion polls. And one of the concerns that clearly emerged after the report of that committee was indeed to do with the reporting of polls and feeling that there were various ways in which the reporting of polls was not necessarily up to standards and was basically saying both to us and the Market Research Society, please could you do something about it? Well, the Market Research Society has, for its point, done something about it. It's come up with quite a detailed guide that it's done together with Impress. We have felt that there perhaps is a gap, a very particular gap in the market. So what we have done is come up with a guide that is essentially designed not for the journalist who regularly reports opinion polls, but who's been handed by their editor a press release about an opinion poll that looks to be interesting. Polling is not what the journalist normally does, and has been told, please write me 800 words by 4 o'clock in the afternoon as to what this says, and then the journalist has to work out what to do. And this is the guide we've come up with now is designed to be read in 10 minutes, is directed very much at somebody who's just not done polling before, not particularly au fait. And it's a bit of a guide, to what to look out for in that press release, and how much of it perhaps to take in gospel, what questions maybe you should ask when you ring up the press contact on the press release and try to get a bit more information, and a little bit of guidance about, well, what should you make sure you do cover so far as readers are concerned when you actually write up your copy. So it's trying to deal with those 3 crucial bits of the journalistic process, quick and easy, and hopefully in an accessible way.
So I'm a journalist. I've got this poll to write up by my deadline. It's setting out some real do's and don'ts in terms of what I should look out for and what I should be alarmed at times if I find in the actual poll.
Yeah, and in a sense, the first thing we kind of draw your attention to is the limitations of polls, and that, frankly, some polls are better than others. First, absolutely crucial thing to look out for is, well, how were the data obtained? Mm-hmm. And if all that's happened is somebody, for example, put something out on Twitter or put something up on their website and say, are you for or against any particular subject? Be very careful, be very suspicious, even if 10, 20, 30, 40,000 people have replied to this poll, because there is no guarantee at all that it's representative. What the kind of poll you're looking out for is a poll which usually done by a reputable company, which is, at least in some way or another, resting on the crucial foundations upon which all polling rests, which is essentially you do it in such a way as to ensure that 99 times out of 100 at least, the sample of people you're going to get is going to be representative. Now, there is a whole area of statistical theory that says that basically what you should do is to just get hold of people at random. So, for example, you can use the postcode address file, which lists all the addresses of all the houses in the UK, and you can select some of the addresses off that, and go off and interview people at randomly selected addresses, and that would be, as it were, the pure way of doing it. That's rarely done these days, but most polling is done by companies who, for example, done over the internet. They know a lot about the people that they are contacting, because hitherto these people have told them, their gender, their age, maybe who they voted the last election, etc. And they can use that information to make sure that who they are interviewing looks reasonably representative of the general public. So crucial, first of all, is just check to look to see who has been asked. Then I think probably the second crucial thing that comes out of the guide is just check what has been asked. And the guide goes into some of the better ways of asking questions, the better ways not. Because the crucial thing you have to remember is the answers that you get in an opinion poll depend on the question asked. And we know that the answer you can get to a subject will depend on how you ask the question. So to give a very simple example, if we say to people, should the government spend money on improving roads, we may well find that quite a lot of people think that that's a good idea. If on the other hand, you say, do you think that taxpayers' money should be spent on improving roads, you won't be surprised to hear that maybe rather fewer people will back that proposition in that instance. In other words, the difference between the government paying for something and its taxpayers' money with its potentially negative connotation, you can get a different answer. And certainly be very, very wary if a question simply says, for example, do you agree that we should ban hunting of foxes by dogs? Any pollster will say, it should say, do you agree or disagree that we should? And even better would be something that says that, do you think that hunting of foxes by dogs is good for the countryside or bad for the countryside? And then also perhaps also ask, is hunting by dogs something that is harmful to foxes or is not harmful to foxes? And do you think that hunting of foxes by dogs helps to protect other animals in the countryside? Not. In other words, it asks a variety of questions, comes at the subject from a variety of angles in such a way that we're just not simply framing the question in such a way that perhaps is designed to encourage people to give a particular answer. So that's just some of the examples and the things to look out for. Just use your critical common sense just to look to see what's been asked. And if that press release doesn't tell you what's been asked, ring up and ask, what was the question that was asked here? And form a judgment as to whether or not you actually think this was a question that simply begat the answer, or whether actually this does present a fair picture of what people might think.
Okay, so to pick up on your point about using your critical common sense, the guide goes on to look at how you might actually analyse the findings. For example, there's a section reminding us to be careful about whether the don't knows have been included or excluded from the results.
Yeah, a couple of things certainly to be aware of in in analysing polls. The first is very often on a survey, people will be asked whether you're in favour or opposed to something, but then there is also the possibility they will say, I frankly don't know. And the potential pitfall here, well, there are two things to bear in mind. If lots of people say don't know, then maybe this was a question that not everybody understood, and maybe it wasn't the best question. You'd be surprised how easy it is for even well-practiced pollsters perhaps to exaggerate the extent to which the public are necessarily well acquainted with the subject and start questioning them in detail about something, and where they rapidly kind of run out of any views to express. What's also ever important about that is that if you decide to exclude the don't knows from how you report. And this is done sometimes, and it's not necessarily wrong, but it needs to be done with care. So if, for example, you say, do you think that the House of Commons should be elected by proportional representation? And you get, let us say, 40% of people saying it should, and only 30% of people saying they're opposed, but then you've got another 30% of people say don't know. Well, that's quite high. But if you take the don't knows out and you say, majority are in favour of proportional representation, and we've got nearly 60% of people in favour, and you then say, majority in favour, well, that's potentially misleading, because the truth is, yes, a majority of those people who expressed a view are in favour, but lots of people didn't, and actually you've only got a plurality of people who are actually positively in favour. So be careful, make sure that don't knows have been excluded, and what difference does that make. But a couple of other things to be aware of. One is, of course, is that quite often a press release might say men were in favour, were more in favour of, let us say, independence for Scotland than were women. And then when you look at the innards, you discover, well, actually, it's only about a 3-point difference. Well, just remember, all polls are estimates. They're all subject to error. And as a result of that, small differences are something of which you should not take too much notice. To use the statistical technical language, the difference is not significant. We don't mean not significant substantively. It means that, frankly, given the size of the sample, given how small the difference is, we can't really be sure there's a difference at all. And the other thing that also flows from this is, don't ever report an opinion poll and where you say 54.3% of people were in favour of something. That's just presenting a level of precision and giving an impression of a level of precision that no opinion poll, however well conducted, however large it is, can frankly offer you. Just be careful that actually, just 54% will do every time. Be very careful. Oh, and also, by the way, equally, just make sure if a poll says 16 to 24-year-olds think this and 65-year-olds think that, just check how many 16 to 24-year-olds were in the poll, because they're often quite difficult to get hold of. And actually, maybe even a poll of 1,000, there weren't that many 16 to 24-year-olds. And if there aren't very many people in a subgroup in a poll, again, user beware.
Well, okay, so we've got that absolute sort of eye on the sample and who's been interviewed. One of the things that the journalist might be wanting to write about is poll surge or support slumps for party X. Can you just remind us of the things to watch out for if we're comparing results over time?
Yeah, there is no doubt, and this is where sometimes what journalists would call news values and how pollsters would like their work to be written up. The polling industry is always going to be more cautious in inclination than a journalist. Journalists are trying to attract readers' attention. Pollsters are concerned that their work is not overinterpreted. And it is not very often when the claim surge or dramatic increase or falls like a stone that these journalistically dramatic wordings are necessarily justified. Just remember, standard statistical theory says that if a poll tells you that 50% of people are in favour of something, well, actually, there's about a 95% chance that between the real figure and the whole population is somewhere between 47 and 53. So if in the next poll, let's say, for example, we had, this has happened in Scottish independence recently, we have 49% in favour in one poll. And in the next poll, it says 51% in favour. Well, you can see the journalistic temptation. Surge in support for independence now means majority of Scots in favour of independence. The trouble is, the difference between 49 and 51, while substantively fascinating and potentially crucial in polling terms, is insignificant. All you can say is, well, actually, Scotland still seems to be divided down the middle, more or less, on independence, and there's not much more that we can say about that. So you've really got to have a difference of certainly more than 3 points. And I think probably many pollsters would say when you're comparing two polls, both of which have a margin of uncertainty between them, anything much less than a 5-point difference should probably not be overinterpreted. And the difficulty for most journalists is it's very rare when you've got two polls conducted over time for there to be a difference of more than 5 points between the reading last time and the reading this time. So there is there undoubtedly a clash, but just be aware. Polls vary randomly without there being necessarily any particular reason other than statistical variation. So you should be very wary about over-interpreting small differences. And in truth, I think probably above all, the one thing that where journalists and pollsters are sometimes most likely disagreeing with that is indeed in this area. We would much prefer you to be more circumspect, even if in terms of news values, it seems to be a little less attractive.
So these are all things we touched on in the new guide, which for 10 minutes read. The idea is it's a real quick guide for the journalist. Yep. Are there anything else that while we're together today that you wanted to share with us from the report?
Well, one of the other things that we do have at the end is, this is as it were, what seems to be the boring bit. So we, at the end of our little guide, say, look, what should I be reporting the poll? So there's a whole list there, things like who commissioned the survey, when the interviewing was done, how was it conducted, who was interviewed. And it begins to seem a little bit of an Anorak's paradise, I suspect, for many a journalist. And they therefore go, oh, I can't possibly want to do all this. The art here, in truth, is that these are often things that you can weave into the web of your narrative in such a way that doesn't seem to be extraneous at all. Now, the honest truth is that if you are reporting the results of a poll that, shall we say, has come from the Countryside Alliance or from the Royal Society for the Protection of Animals, i.e. groups that have a locus and a point of view in the debate about hunting, and they've commissioned a poll about hunting, actually telling the reader who did it is actually rather important. And again, telling people whether or not the poll was done last week or whether it was done 2 months ago might be quite important to understanding, what are the implications, etc. And again, giving them saying, well, is this a poll of 1,000 people or is it a poll of 4,000 people? Again, gives them an idea. Now, usually this is something you don't need to have a paragraph, boring paragraph at the end that says, well, Ipsos Mori did a poll of 1,200 people between the 24th and the 26th of March, at the behest of the Daily Mail, etc., etc. You can usually weave this into your narrative and weave it in such a way that actually it's helping readers to understand the import and implications of this poll and what perhaps they should be taking away from it.
Great, so thank you, John. It's on the website and downloadable now for journalists to, if you like, look behind the anorak and, as you say, take some of those key things away as they write up the polls. And there's some guidance also at the back to the MRS detailed documentation with Impress and 1 or 2 other sources for us if we want to go deeper. So thank you very much for joining us, and thank you everybody for watching our short overview of the new Journalist Guide to Opinion Polls. Thank you very much.
Thanks so much, Simon.